Welcome to Historical USA. Today, I invite you to set aside what you think you know about colonial America and join me as we peer into a world haunted by restless spirits, both literal and psychological. Now, you can find many videos on one of the most popular events in colonial American history, the Salem Witch Trials. But here at Historical USA, we dig a little deeper. Our journey connects the chilling aftershocks of the Salem Witch Trials and delves into what historians now call the Witchcraft Hangover and the explosive religious fervor of the First Great Awakening. Now, I have done a separate video on the First Great Awakening, and I will link that up here in the corner and down in the description box below. I highly recommend you go give that a watch, then come back and finish watching this one. But what if the demons of the terrified 17th century New Englanders, guilt, fear, and spiritual anxiety, primed the soil for the outpouring of fire and brimstone that swept the colonies in the 18th century? Let's walk together through history's dark valley and see how the shadow of Salem stretched all the way into the light of revival. Imagine New England, winter 1692. The snows haven't thawed, and the fireside talk is full of rumors, portents, and unease. In the tiny farming community of Salem Village, the devil is believed to be loose. 9-year-old Betty Paris and her cousin Abigail Williams are seized by strange fits and screaming, contorting, and babbling. The local doctor, baffled, whispers a diagnosis: witchcraft. The evil hand is upon Salem. Quickly, the accusations multiply. Soon, the whole community feels gripped by invisible forces. As one historian writes, Salem's witchcraft hysteria was just the most spectacular and certainly most memorable of the witch trials. 200 people faced charges, and 20 died at the executioner's hand. But Salem was only the tip of an iceberg of spiritual anxiety. As the New England Historical Society notes, plenty of people in New England were persecuted for witchcraft, and not just in Salem, Massachusetts. Witches had troubled the European colonists from the get-go. In 1635, Plymouth Colony made it a crime to form a solemn compact with the devil by way of witchcraft. Now, let's not forget that this horror was part of a much larger pattern. In 1647, Alls Young was the first woman executed for witchcraft in Connecticut. The witch panic would peak in Hartford 30 years before Salem. And between 1647 and 1663, at least 19 people were hanged as witches in New England. Salem's panic was simply the last and worst outbreak. The trials themselves had the elements of high drama and low tragedy. Spectral evidence, bodily marks, accusations flying through neighborhoods, the afflicted contorting in court. Here are the words of Cotton Mather, one of the day's leading ministers.
Go tell mankind that there are devils and witches, and that though those night birds least appear where the daylight of the gospel comes, yet New England has had examples of their existence and operation.
Mather's best-selling 1689 book, Memorable Providences Related to Witchcraft and Possession, describing the Goodwin children's supposed bewitchment, seeded the imagination of Puritan New England, priming an entire culture for hysterics when calamity struck. So why did this panic take root here at Salem at this time? Samuel Sewell, one of the judges of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, described a Salem courtroom.
Went to Salem, where in the meeting house was a very great assembly. 'Twas awful to see how the afflicted persons were agitated.
Why this intensity? New England Puritans saw themselves as God's chosen people, fighting a war against Satan for the soul of the New World. As historian John Puttendemos notes, witches could be blamed for a good deal of trouble and difficulty. To discover an unseen hand at work in one's life was to dispel mystery, to explain misfortune, and to excuse incompetence. Women were particularly at risk, as Puritans believed that the devil's favorite way of testing Puritans was to place witches in the heart of their community, and women, especially unmarried, strong-willed, or marginal women, were prime suspects. The biblical echo of Exodus chapter 22, verse 18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," was their warrant. But what made the trials a nightmare, though, was the legal machinery. Spectral evidence, testimony that the spirit or specter of the accused had afflicted others, was allowed. There was, as one modern analyst put it, no way to rebut the charges that one secretly conspired with the devil. Neighbor could accuse neighbor. Old feuds and suspicions flared anew. The result? The court quickly turned into a killing machine. 200, or probably more, were charged in what historians now believe was a massive case of petty jealousies and score settling. 19 died by hanging, 1 man was crushed to death, and 5 people died in jail. Puritan spirituality mixed with law, fear, and politics created a crucible for panic. As the dust settled, New England had gazed into its own soul and recoiled. Hello, history friends. I am so excited to announce that we have partnered with Classical Learner. I am a historian, but more importantly, I am a homeschooling mother. Now, I get questions all the time from other homeschool parents and other parents concerned they might not be teaching their children enough social studies or civics or history. Classical Learner is a great way to help your child in all of those areas. Their children's book series, Cubs to Bears, will help your children understand things like what is the First Amendment, what is the Second Amendment, what is the Federal Reserve. They will teach your children things like critical thinking and health and nutrition. One thing that I'm really excited is they are also now rolling out historical works. Their first is George Washington by Ferdinand Schmidt that was originally published in 1911. Now, this book tells the story of George Washington from his upbringing to his ambitions to his ascension as the father of a new nation. It provides a really unique insight into the grievances of the American colonists and the issues they had with England and the culture that made 1776 possible. This is part of Classical Learner's mission to take lost, unpolitically correct history and make it available to the public. And you can get 10% off of any of these products when you use the coupon code HistoricalUSA. You can visit the link down below in the description bar if you are interested in taking a look at some of their children's books and some of these great historical works. Now back to the video. The executions ended, but the wounds did not. The Salem trials were later declared unlawful, and the verdicts annulled by the General Court of Massachusetts. In time, the community began to reckon with what had happened. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the chief accusers, eventually confessed to being deluded by Satan into denouncing innocent people and pled for forgiveness. Consider Samuel Sewall, who in 1697 stood before Boston's South Church and listened as his apology was read aloud.
Samuel Sewall desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and especially desiring prayers that God, who has unlimited authority, would pardon that sin and all his other sins, personal and relative.
The guilt and shame were palpable. As one historian put it, quote, "It constituted both a personal turning point for Sewall and a turning point in the emergence of an American moral and religious conscience. But the spiritual injury lingered, a hangover of collective guilt, fear, and anxiety that went deeper than one's individual regrets." John Hale, a minister present at much of the Salem Witch Trials, remembered, quote,
"Such was the darkness of that day, the tortures and lamentations of the afflicted, and the power of former presidents, that we walked in the clouds and could not see our way.
There were financial reparations and attempts at healing, but the memory endured. This was the witchcraft hangover, a pervasive sense of collective moral and spiritual crisis, a suspicion that the devil perhaps still lingered close at hand, or worse, within oneself. As historian Gretchen Adams would later write, quote, "No other historical evidence has provided such a wide range of scholars with a subject that so stubbornly resists a final resolution. The specter of Salem still haunts the American imagination." So after Salem, what changed? For one, the law itself. By 1715, the last statutes making witchcraft a capital offense had disappeared from the books in New England. There would be no more executions for witchcraft. Belief in witches persisted, of course. Well into the 18th and even the 19th century, legends about butter-churning mysterious illnesses and evil eyes circulated. And individuals like Hannah Cranach retained their reputation as cunning folk, but formal persecutions faded. The courts and the clergy had learned a hard lesson about spectral evidence and collective panic. But the spiritual anxiety did not dissipate. Instead, it turned inward. Puritan ministers, ever concerned with the state of souls, intensified their warnings against sin, temptation, and the devil's lurking schemes. As historian Susan Friedman notes, the Puritans viewed the world with the force of evil engaged in an unceasing battle for the souls of the Lord's legions. Puritan spirituality always stressed a rational faculty that provides moral self-knowledge and moral judgment, dealing with questions authoritatively as God's voice in terms of right and wrong, duty and desert. But after Salem, the sense of spiritual danger sharpened. Ministers urged self-examination, endless searching for God's grace, and a bulwark against another outbreak of evil. As the 18th century dawned, New England's strict Puritan discipline was slowly slipping. Churches struggled to maintain membership. The visible saints who could publicly testify to conversion were scarce. Enter Solomon Stoddard, a congregational minister in Northampton and eventually the mentor of Jonathan Edwards. Stoddard was a significant innovator. He believed that the path to salvation should be wider. He launched 5 local revivals between 1679 and 1719, often marked by special seasons of mercy in which young people especially turned and gave their lives to God. He advocated for the halfway covenant, which allowed those without a public conversion experience to partake in church sacraments and have their children baptized, which was a controversial position for the day. Stoddard insisted the gloriousness of God has a commanding power in the heart. He believed that emotional experience and heartfelt religion, not just intellectual assent or public reputation, should make true faith. Stoddard's methods and innovations spread across the Connecticut River Valley, sowing the seeds for an even greater religious movement. By the time of his death in 1729, a new generation was poised to take the stage, with an even greater hunger for assurance and a deep fear for judgment. Now let's leap to the 1730s and 1740s. A spiritual fire swept colonial America, the first great awakening. Now, what makes this revival unique? It was loud, it was emotional, it was terrifying and rapturous. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield poured terror into the hearts of their hearers, stirring both conviction and hope. Edwards' most famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," captured the mood perfectly.
There is nothing that keeps wicked men at any one moment out of hell, but the mere pleasure of God. The devil stands ready to fall upon him, and seize them as his own, at what moment God shall permit him. They belong to him, he has their souls in his possession, and under his dominion. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string. Nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood.
The effect? Well, as Edwards himself wrote in Northampton in the spring of 1735, the town seemed to be full of the presence of God. A loose, careless person could scarcely be found. George Whitefield took this message on the road. An Anglican from Britain, Whitefield traversed the colonies, preaching to crowds, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands. A contemporary said of him, quote, "I have seen upwards of 1,000 people hang on his word with breathless silence, broken only by an occasional half-suppressed sob. He is a born orator." Benjamin Franklin marveled at the power of Whitefield's oratory and noted, quote, "It was wonderful to see the change soon made in the manners of our inhabitants. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious." Itinerant preachers crisscrossed the landscape. New denominations, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, sprang up. The old Congregationalists and Anglicans, guarded of tradition, split between old lights who decried the emotional excess and new lights who embraced the revival's energy and the promise that personal conversion, not merely correct doctrine or ritual, was the key to salvation. But why did the message land with such force? Why did colonists, especially in New England, respond so passionately to talk of wrath, hellfire, and the soul's peril? Well, let's pause and recall the spiritual wounds left by Salem. The witchcraft hangover had left the region steeped in anxiety about the devil's power, the danger of hypocrisy, the possibility of self-delusion. As one historian notes, the intense and oppressive nature of Puritan religion can be viewed as the main culprit in the colonial witch trials. It also set the stage for a stirring of revival when the forms of faith seemed dead and conscience ached for relief. Puritan spiritual practices had always emphasized self-examination according to the scriptures in general and to the moral law of the Ten Commandments in particular. Self-examination is a discipline, the Puritans said. It includes asking yourself questions to know whether you truly are walking in obedience to the Word of God. But in a society afflicted with collective guilt, this discipline could easily tip into despair. The terrors of death, the uncertainty of salvation, and the sense that the devil had gotten the upper hand fueled a hunger for certainty, one promised in the new birth offered by the revival preachers. Now, not everyone welcomed the revival. The Old Lights, a coalition of traditionalist ministers and their congregations, accused the New Lights of encouraging disorder, emotional excess, and schemes. One Old Light leader, Charles Chauncey, wrote, quote, "I shall first mention itinerant preaching. This had its rise, and at least in these parts, from Mr. Whitefield, though I could never see upon what warrant. He went about preaching for one province, colony, and parish to another, where the gospel was already preached. Old Lights saw the emotional displays, fainting, weeping, even convulsing, as a dangerous firmament in the passions. The revivals sometimes fractured communities, splitting denominations and undermining respect for traditional authority. Yet the movement also democratized religion, giving voice to women, the young, and people at the lower end of the social spectrum, and propelled the message that individuals could bring about their own salvation by accepting Jesus Christ, rather than relying on clerical mediation or social status. The new denominations and missionary zeal reached out to previously marginalized populations, including Blacks and Indigenous people. But let's get back to my main thesis. What then is the connection between the witch trials legacy and the Great Awakening? Here is the crux. The spiritual and emotional conditions left by the witchcraft hangover: guilt, fear, obsession with the devil and conscience, anxiety about damnation, primed New England for the emotionally intense, fear-driven preaching of the Great Awakening. In the words of historian Thomas Kidd, the Salem Witch Trials and the spiritual self-doubt they engendered helped set the stage for an era of traveling preachers such as George Whitefield and an emphasis on evangelism. Puritanism's deep underlying tension, as one account put it, was that death was both a blessed release from the trials of this world into the joys of everlasting life, and God's punishment for human sinfulness, filling even the godly with spiritual torment and anxiety in the face of death. After Salem, this anxiety intensified, turning many churchgoers into dry tinder for the sparks of revival. The agony of uncertainty supplied fuel. The promise of assurance supplied hope. The emergence of individualistic, emotional, new birth Christianity in the Awakening was in some sense a massive cultural therapy, a way to resolve or redirect the guilt, anxiety, and hysteria that had torn communities apart in the years after Salem. The darkness of the witch trials had shown the dangers of a community obsessed with rooting out spiritual evil in others. The Awakening shifted that obsession inward, offering an answer to spiritual anxiety, not the persecution of neighbors, but the conversion of the self. In the end, the Great Awakening changed the American colonies. As one historian observed, the First Great Awakening was the most significant religious movement in the colonial era, sparking an increase in Protestant denominations, contributing to the ideals of the American Revolution by emphasizing the power of the individual over the power of clergymen or monarchs. It was a shared experience that connected the colonies. The emotional power of the revival finished uprooting many old barriers, religious, political, and cultural. And the long emotional tale of Salem's horror gradually receded, not through forgetfulness, but through transformation. The colonial soul passed through fire and shadow, first in the dizzying panic of the witch trials, then in the redemptive heat of the Awakening. That journey changed forever what it meant to be American. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode. Make sure you like and subscribe and share with your friends. Bye.